I bind you, Nancy, from doing harm. Harm against other people and harm against yourself.
Imagine if Sarah was like over dramatic. She was like all soft. She was like, I bind you, Nancy. But imagine she was like a drag queen. I would watch that craft. The craft with drag, the drag craft, I would watch that shit so fast. The craft is already a banger and it's only missing several drag queens. That's how I feel. Hello and welcome back to It's Queer Magic. It's me, Kierbo, and today we're chugging right along with the Alphabet Superset Week B. And as you have probably guessed, we are talking about binding. Am I going to do that every time? I don't know, maybe. Stick around and see. Binding is a powerful magic, something that is one of the more ancient recorded magics. We actually have a lot of recorded text of binding style magics going back to the medieval times, going back to ancient Greeks and Romans, going back forever and ever and always, amen. Okay, binding has been there. It was like, and the Lord made the earth on the sixth day in the middle of the night, 3 a.m. He was like, you know what else I should make? Binding. And then he was like, let me rest, right? It's that intrinsic to magical systems. Binding is such a powerful magic that even though it is oftentimes the best choice moving forward for many different situations, it's definitely something that you should think twice about. I'm not saying that I'm like anti-binding. I just think that we should be sure we're doing what we want to do before we do it. And binding is one of those things that we want to be sure about what we're doing, about what we want, very clear about what we want before we embark upon that path. Magically binding or a binding spell usually has one of a few objectives in mind, either to make sure that something does not happen, to make sure that something does happen, or to stick two things together. You know, that it could be argued that those are sort of the same thing. Like if I want something to make sure that something happens, I'm also technically binding one thing with another. And one thing may be a person and the other thing may be like a circumstance, but I'm still taking these two things, energies, and tying them together to ensure my desired outcome. But I still feel like it's a good way to break it down. Either you definitely want something to happen, you want something to definitely stop happening, or you want to bind two people, two energies, two things together. Again, I'm not like the wizard of the world. Like, I'm sure there's a million other ways or things that people think of, have thought of, have utilized it for that counts as binding magic, and I just don't know about it. I'm only 34. What do you, I mean, am I 34 or am I 33? Am I 34 or am I 33? No, I'm pretty sure I'm 34. Of course, because of the nature of binding magic, a lot of people consider it to be baneful magic, which I do get and don't necessarily disagree with, but it's one of those complicated things. Sure, you can bind someone to you against their will in an ill-advised love spell, and that would be bad, gross, shitty, right? Like, not good behavior, toxic, not cute. And, you know, in that case, definitely would consider that baneful magic. But on the other hand, if you are binding someone away from harming you or your community, I don't know that at that point it would be considered baneful magic. And, you know, sure, maybe it is because the definition of baneful could include like engaging in or interfering with other people's free will. But I don't think that the right the right that somebody has to hurt me is more important than my right to remain safe and protected. You know what I mean? Because those people are running around interfering and with my will to be just like unbothered. And that's my free will. I'd like to not be hurt, damaged, upset by you, bothered by you in any way. And your will is to upset, damage, bother, and hurt me. And so somebody's will is going to get interfered with here, right? So that's where I'm standing. And on the other hand, things like a hand fasting, right? A marriage, a wedding, those kinds of rituals are totally binding magics that or binding rituals. You know, some people may not consider their wedding magic, but you're coming together, you're making an oath, like you're exchanging a ring, like that's magic. Sorry, that's ritual. But that we don't consider toxic, right? We're not like, oh, their relationship is toxic because they're together. Like they made a promise to each other, gross, toxic, painful, right? That's definitely a positive thing. So under those examples, binding can't, in my opinion, necessarily be completely relegated to a baneful magic zone, because it can fully be helpful, beautiful, consensual, and that's really the key, right? Consent is the key. I think that as long as you're doing it, I was going to say something I don't agree with, so I'm going to not say it, because I don't agree with that, because I ultimately think, I was going to say that as long as you do it with everybody's consent, then it's fine. But ultimately, like if you are stopping someone from hurting you and magic is your only recourse, baby, use the magic. You know what I'm saying? Bind the bitch. Do it. Do it. Do it. I support you and I'll support you till the end of time. You know what I mean? And so, sure, it may be baneful magic, but I think that there are times in which baneful magic is the only recourse and the most loving action to take. So, you might disagree with me from where you're at, but for where I'm at, I'm here making the video and I can't hear what you're saying. So we can have this conversation when I can hear you. So why would you want to bind someone? Hold on, one more time again. So what would be the reason that you would want to bind someone, something, whatever, in your actual practice, if it's such like a gray morality type of thing? Of course, like I already said, hand fasting is a binding. If you want to put some magic onto your marital promises or your relational promises, I think that that's so beautiful and something that you should absolutely engage in if you're called to. And like I said, I am not against binding an abuser from harming yourself or the community instead of standing back and letting them wreak havoc. Of course, there are physical, mundane world actions that can and should be taken in order to protect people. But as we know, we live in a world where abusers often are protected. So sometimes their only recourse is magic. In that case, a binding spell could be super helpful, especially if you're not in a place where you enjoy casting negative things on people or wanting some negative outcome and you just want it to be protection aimed. Binding is an excellent option. Now you could start to mess with fate in the future, which is your right. You know, this is your life. You can do whatever you want. Free will universe, and that I firmly believe. So if you want to do that, you could do that. In the sense that you could try to bind yourself to an outcome. I will be XYZ, right? I will do XYZ. And you can do that. But I think a binding spell is a little bit more, more of a semi-permanent type of solution, because you want what you want now, and if you change, you grow and you decide that you want something different, there are other magics that could easily have taken the place of this binding that are more easily undone or redirected than a binding spell. Now, if you were going to utilize actual rope and knots or even energetic rope and knots, then theoretically you could untie that. You could sever that connection. The cord cutting exists for a reason, right? You could do that. But I think that if you're talking about your like actual future and something you're trying to tie to yourself, I would just utilize timeline jumping. You can always jump to another timeline over and over and over and over again to something that feels good or something that you're into in that moment. And that's an easier is a funny word, but it's a more easeful way, a simpler way of changing directions without having to undo magics that you put out into the world. I'm not saying it's impossible. Again, it is not impossible to undo a spell, but it's, harder from my experience. Maybe that's your skill and I love that for you. It's not my skill. So, it's not my skill. I don't want to get into that, but ultimately you can do a cord cutting. You can unbind a spell if you have made it so, if you've made it possible. But a lot of times we are emotionally activated when we're doing binding because we're so upset or we're trying to stop something. There's a lot of high stakes. And so when you're trying to bind a certain outcome or a certain future to yourself, with all of that energy, it's going to take just as much energy or even more to undo it and course correct your life. So I don't advise that. Just timeline jump, baby. It's so much better. You could just boom, boom, boom to a different version of your world, to a different version of yourself, to a different version of your future. And then you have the freedom to bounce again if you want to, when you inevitably change, because you will. I know we talked about this in the last video about banishing, but I think it's even more important, maybe not even more, but at least equally important to discuss with binding, because you do not ever know who in the spirit world is protecting someone, what energetic protections, wards that they have set up that you might encounter, what kind of reversing spell you might encounter. You can think and assume that someone has no relationship to magic and be wrong, right? So you want to have your protection spells, your protection routine, your protection suite, if you will, really down before you engage in a binding practice. You know, even if you are like making like Sarah and trying to bind Nancy against doing harm against herself and others, like that's not that specific of a spell, right? Binding someone against doing harm to others, carte blanche, full stop, no, what's the word I'm looking for? No, not variables. What? You know, variables. God, I don't know. I've lost the word. Mercury is retrograde, you know, it's just where we're at. But if you just do like, I bind you from doing harm against yourself and other people, carte blanche, without any exceptions, that's the word, exceptions, without any exceptions, then what if somebody has to actually defend themselves, and in defending themselves, they are required to cause harm? There's no other option but to harm them in order to save themselves. You have effectively bound them against that kind of harm without being specific intentionally with your energy, and also being specific with your wording, with the spell that you've actually crafted. Now, that particular spell was, you know, made by a real witch, but it's also like adjusted, so it's not just as easy to take the spell from the movie and invoke some scary beings, right? But magic is magic, energy is energy, and if you intend it, it very well may work. So I think it's really important to be specific about what you actually want to happen with your binding. I just think that's a good magical tip always, to know what you actually want, to do some journaling and some divination to find out what it is that you're actually looking for, and if your current choice of action is even going to get you where you want to go, because oftentimes it does not. And we don't want that. We want what we want, right? So you want to make sure that your protection game is on point, because even if you're not wrong and they don't have anything to do with magic and aren't intentionally doing magic, you don't know who they are, you don't know who they've been, and you don't know what's on their side. And because of that, you want to make sure that you're good. You just want to make sure that you're covered, you're safe, before you do any kind of magic that is going to be on someone who is who might not agree, might not consent to any kind of magic engaging with them. They may very well be protected by something you don't want to go up against. For that reason, again, very important to have that down before you willy-nilly throw binding spells around, right? That's just what I think. That's what I feel. And again, wanted this to be shorter. So those are the things I like to talk about today with binding. I'm not giving you spells because I feel weird about that, so I'm not doing it. But if you have any experience with the binding, or binding gone wrong, or binding gone right, hit me up. I will say that binding is one of the first magics I did, and because of that, I have advice against just randomly doing it. I actually did try to stop someone from doing harm on themselves, and it actually did work, but it wasn't without consequence. And I think that it's really important to remember that we are not always seeing every angle of every story, and we're also not seeing every possibility of the future when it comes to the consequences of the actions that we're doing. Consequences is not just a bad word, right? It's not just negative connotation, it's also positive. Either way, we don't know all of the variables, all of the possibilities of what could happen. And so making sure that you're doing what you actually want to do, and it's what you're doing is going to have the outcome that you intend to, and keeping up on your divination so that you are able to inquire before and after to see what has happened, if any other work is required, or if you need to make any other choices or any other actions to make sure you get where you want to go. And the safety is made safe, the future is made secure, right? The people are actually bound together with the ability to leave each other if things change, right? We don't want our spells to be open-ended or to not have the exceptions that we intend them to, right? We don't want somebody to bound to somebody forever just cause. It's not the move. Okay. So I love you. Thanks for hanging around. If you liked this video, like it, subscribe, stick around. We're going to do more things than the Alphabet Superset, but right now we're playing Alphabet Superset game. Let me know what you thought down below and follow me on Instagram if you want more actual like witch tips and stuff and tarot tips, and take care of yourselves. The new moon in Virgo just went down. So if you're feeling a certain way, I get it. Take a deep breath. Think about what you want before you ask for it, and may all of your blessings rain down upon you in the highest and best of all, and harm to none. All right. Love you. Bye.